Romans chapter 3, Exodus chapter 5. In Romans chapter 3, verse 18, in summing up a paragraph that starts in verse 10 and goes all the way down to 18, verse 18 said, "There is no fear of God before their eyes." There is no fear of God before their eyes. And then back in the book of Exodus in chapter 5, when Moses and Aaron are going to see Pharaoh, in verse 1 it says, "Thus saith the Lord God of Israel, let my people go, that they may hold a feast unto me in the wilderness. And Pharaoh said, Who is the Lord that I should obey his voice? Who is the Lord that I should obey his voice?" And Paul said, there is no fear of God before their eyes. I want to speak to you this evening simply about the fear of God. The fear of God. Shall we bow our heads for prayer? Gracious Father, we come to you again at this critical time of the service now when we're leaning so heavily upon you for your help. I pray you send this blessed Holy Spirit to quicken our hearts this evening. Touch my mind, my thoughts, my very words. And while you're helping me, help the people to hear and get the message you have for us. And we'll be careful to praise you. We ask it in Christ's name. Amen. Moses had his first encounter with God on the backside of the desert. He was tending sheep. He had already spent his first 40 years of life in Egypt. In a premature attempt to rescue his fellow Jews, he got himself in trouble, killed an Egyptian, fled for his life. On the backside of the desert, God began to reveal himself to Moses through the burning bush. You know the account. He sees the burning bush. He says, I'll draw up close to this, see what this is all about. And the voice comes from the bush, instructing him to remove his shoes. It's holy ground, and there God gives him his instructions to go to Egypt. Moses will need to learn more about the fear of God. And Pharaoh is going to learn something about the fear of God. It took 10 plagues to get the message across to Pharaoh. Pharaoh thought he could play fast and loose with God. The Calvinists like to tell us that poor Pharaoh had no opportunity at all to make his own choices. They like to talk about predestination. They like to misconstrue from verses in Romans about predestination. Poor Pharaoh, his heart was hardened. But if you read it closely, particularly in the original text, it isn't until between the 5th and the 6th plague that God begins to help Pharaoh to harden his heart. In the first 5 plagues, he's got perfect freedom to select which way he's going to go. Well, he says, after the waters turned to blood, all right, he said, I'll let you go. And then immediately changes his mind. And then he gives in, and then he changes his mind, and it's back and forth. Finally, it's as though God said, old boy, if you want a hardened heart, I'm going to help your heart to get hard. And from there on in, it's a done deal. We know what's going to happen to Pharaoh. He'll have to learn what the fear of God is all about. He'll have to learn who God is and how he's going to have to learn to fear him. The Canaanites also are going to have to learn about the fear of God. When the spies were sent out by Joshua, they came to the house of Rahab, the harlot at Jericho. And when they got there, we read in Joshua, as Rahab relates to the spies, how the fear of God, the God of the Israelites, has seized hold of the people of the land of Canaan. They're hearing about this large company of people traveling their way, and she said, the fear of God has seized hold of our heart. The Canaanites, too, had to learn something about the fear of God. I'm convinced the fear of God is the missing ingredient in much of our society today. In fact, our people, by and large, don't have much fear of anything. There's a lack of respect for authority. I see it in the classroom. We see it in the church. I'm just not comfortable with members of the congregation talking to their preacher using his first name. Did I touch a raw nerve there? I still believe the man of God is entitled to at least be a brother and his wife a sister. I don't hold out for a lot of dignified titles. When I got my earned doctorate, my people started doctoring me. I said, forget it, just let me be Pastor Kaufman here in the pulpit. There's a place, though, for authority. There's a place to respect authority. And we've gone a long way down the wrong road away from that fear and proper authority. I want to tell you about some things that fear can do for you. Fear, first of all, is a great motivator. When fear strikes the heart of an individual, you can respond in some very out-of-the-ordinary ways. You've heard accounts of a little 5-foot woman who goes out and sees her husband who's been working under the car. The car has fallen off the jack and he's crushed, and a 5-foot lady who barely weighs 100 pounds can go over and lift a car off of her husband. Can you explain that to me? Fear for his life. The adrenaline kicks in and she's able to do something. People can run fast under fear. I had a man in my church in Marion. He came over from the old United Methodist Church. A fellow from Texarkana, Texas. Lee liked to tell me stories about how it was down in that end of the country. He had that big old Texan drawl, and I just loved to hear him talk and he could tell a good story. One day he told about his Uncle Newt and his brother who had gone catfishing. I almost said catfish hunting because that's the way you do it. He told me how you did it down there. He said you go down along this I don't know, some body of water or some backwater or something. The water has been flowing swift at times and has eroded part of the bank, and backing under the bank would be tree roots and some debris, and he said the big catfish would get up in there and hide. He said on a hot day you could get down there and put on your waders and wade out and reach up under that bank of the river and feel around and get a hold of a big catfish and pull it out. He said one day, he said old Uncle Newt must have been somewhere in his 80s, an old gentleman. He stood up on the path and his nephew is down in his waders reaching around under there, and he got a hold of a big fat catfish, he thought, and pulled it out and had hold of a water moccasin right in the middle. Sort of a stubby, fat thing. I don't know. Have you ever held a cottonmouth snake in your hand? I suspect the adrenaline began to move. As soon as he saw what he had done, he was as surprised as the snake was. He said his first impulse was to use centrifugal force to his advantage, and he began swinging that thing around his head like a cowboy swings a lariat. He yelled while he was doing it. That seemed to help things a little bit. And he's winding this thing up, slowly letting it go, and it's sliding out through his hands, and he's working his way toward the tail, but he's swinging it so fast it can't coil up enough to strike. And finally he's clear out to the end of that thing, and he's whipping it around, and he winds it up and lets it go, and it went like a boomerang through the air and landed on the path right at Uncle Newt's feet. And then Uncle Newt's adrenaline kicked in. He said he jumped over that thing and took off running in a cloud of dust. I don't know how far he went before he finally was convinced he'd outrun the snake. I say fear is a great motivator. A fellow in our conference back home tells a story about an old miner back in the middle of the 19th century. He'd been riding for weary hours across the hot sands of the desert. The wind was blowing and the tumbleweed was coming across his way. He's riding along in the old mule. The cowboy picks up his trail behind him, sees him in the horizon, and his horse is a little faster, and after a while he overtakes the old timer on the mule. The cowboy decided to have a little fun. He just happened to have strapped on his side a 6-shooter revolver. You know, the Colt 45 that won the West. He decided to have a little fun with the old man. And he said, old timer, he says, get down off that mule. He says, I'm going to learn you how to dance. And he pulled that revolver out and he began shooting at the old miner's feet. And that miner is jumping up and down. Those bullets are ricocheting around there. And that cowboy's just laughing his head off, having fun watching the old man jump around. He's learning him how to dance. Well, he ran out of ammunition, and he reaches around and he starts getting some bullets to reload while he's got that chamber out of the side of the revolver. That old gold miner, he reaches over the side of his mule, and he had a 30-30 Winchester down the scabbard. And he slid that thing out of there, and he jacked one home, and he pointed at that boy. He said, "Cowboy," he said, "have you ever kissed a mule?" And that cowboy said, "No, but I've always wanted to." I say fear is a great motivator. Fear can be learned. Fear must be taught. Psalm 34 says, "Come, my children, and I will teach you the fear of the Lord." Fear doesn't come naturally sometimes. It has to be taught. I remember back in the middle 60s when Vietnam was heating up, I thought the patriotic thing to do was to enlist in the Air Force, and so I did. Uncle Sam flew me off to San Antonio, Texas, and I found myself in boot camp with a lot of tough-looking hombres. We picked up quite a number of them in Detroit, some big boys right off the streets of downtown Detroit, rough-looking guys. Now, I had something going for me that they didn't. My brother and I had grown up in a home where there was a proper sense of authority. My dad began to teach us right early in life what authority was all about. And when my dad spoke, it was yes, sir. It was no, sir. He spoke, you moved. If you even looked like you was hesitating, you could join the 92nd Airborne before you knew what was happening. Dad was a hard taskmaster. But I found that when I got to boot camp, it was pretty easy going for me. It was no big deal. When those sergeants would bark out their orders, I had already been conditioned how to respond. I remember one hot day out in front of the barracks, one of those big old boys off the streets of Detroit was in my group, and the sergeant stopped the group, and marched up to this guy and put his face about that far away from the boy from Detroit's face and barked an order at him. And I can still remember that guy from Detroit said, "Make me." Wow, it went into fast motion. Things started happening all over the place. First thing I know, here were a couple of military police. They didn't lead this boy away, they just ripped him out of the ranks and dragged him away. Truth be told, I never saw him again. I couldn't tell you what happened to him. They probably shipped him back to Detroit, figured he wasn't worth messing with. I don't know. Fear must be learned. Come, my children, and I will teach you the fear of the Lord. Psalm 111 says, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom." This is what Pharaoh's problem was. He had no proper fear of God. And so he's short on wisdom. He doesn't know how to respond. He thinks he can say things like, "Who is the Lord that I should obey him?" Fear will keep you from getting hurt. I've heard tell of the mother who's got the hot stove in the kitchen. Or maybe, like in my family room, we have a stove in the fireplace. And the mother realizes this child doesn't know what high temperature is all about. Have you ever seen a mother do it? And so she leaves the little child up to him, up to the stove, or to the burner on top of the range, and takes that child's hand and gets it near so she can feel the heat. And mother will say something like, "Bernie, Bernie, don't touch, don't touch." What's mother doing? Mother's instructing some fear of high temperature in that child. Any mother would do that. You can't let a child just wander around where there are dangerous things. It must be taught that the stove is hot. You've heard of teenagers who look like they're heading down the wrong road, and some group will get them together. Sometimes the police department will sponsor something like this, or the high school or some agency. They'll load these guys up on a bus, and they'll take them for a trip to the local prison. And they'll take these teenage boys through the prison, just let them look around, just get a sense of how friendly it is there. Let them look through the bars at some of those guys. And some of the trustees, they'll bring them into a room and and they'll talk to these young guys, and they're intentionally trying to scare the wits out of them. And they say it's quite effective. It really gets their attention. It puts some fear into them. Have you ever heard of anybody who says something like this among the teenagers or the young man trying to show off how macho he is? He says, I ain't afraid of anything. You know, I've met some guys that they're not afraid of anything. They're a loose cannon. That's scary. There are some guys out there who aren't afraid of anything, and I give them lots of room. I hope you never get in that position where you're not afraid of anything. May the Lord give us each one a healthy fear this evening. Fear can paralyze you. After God saved me, He began to deal with me about some restitutions that it was necessary for me to make. Some of those restitutions were harder than others. I could take the rest of my allotted time here this evening to tell you about some of those restitutions, but I'll tell you what, God wasn't going to give me any more light until I made them. I had to drive to some other towns. I had to write some letters. I remember one time when I was in the Air Force, I was a medic. I'd been an X-ray technician before I went in. I was already ready for my registry, my national exam. Uncle Sam found that out. He just shipped me to a hospital in Wichita, Kansas for my entire enlistment. While I was there, I don't know why I did it, but in our supply closet, we had some GI issue fly spray and some masking tape. Now, what in the world did I need with some fly spray and masking tape? I don't know. I just recently got married, and I thought, surely, since I was government issue myself, how can I steal from myself? We both belong to the government, and somehow I rationalized it would be all right to take a can or two of fly spray home and a couple of rolls of masking tape. Couldn't amount to more than a couple of dollars. Never gave it another thought. But you know, after I got saved, the Lord dealt with me about a couple of old Army green cans of fly spray. And then the devil got on the act, and he said, you know, you're messing around with the federal government. You go making some restitution to some military installation, you're liable to have the FBI out here knocking on your door. And Satan began to blow that thing up bigger and bigger. And you talk about getting paralyzed with fear. But one day God gave me the grace, gave me the courage, and I sat down and I wrote a letter and I wrote a check. I figured out what it was, add a little bonus to it and some interest for good measure, and I sent the thing off to the air base. Now, I would have loved to have been a mouse in the corner as that letter made its rounds around the base. It was a hot potato. Nobody knew what to do with that thing. The Air Force just wasn't used to men sending checks back to make restitutions for something that happened 6 or 8 years. Well, this thing went all over the place. It went to the colonel who was in charge of the hospital. It went to the supply, around and around, and finally it came back to my house. And it's helpful for me every once in a while just to get that letter out of the file. It still has the check stapled to it that wasn't cashed. And some lieutenant in some supply office somewhere said, Dear Mr. Kaufman, we don't really understand what this is all about, but it sounds like something that makes you feel better to do it. We don't know what to do with your money. We really don't want your money, and have a good day. And signed some first lieutenant. The FBI never came calling. In fact, every once in a while it just does me good to get that out and read it. Here, Satan, took a look at that. But fear just about tripped me up at that point. I could go on and on. You could probably tell some stories too. Not long after I got saved, the old class leader came to me and said, Now, Paul, he said, we want you to lead prayer meeting Wednesday night. It was wintertime. I was scared to death. I just wasn't used to getting up in front of people. What am I going to say? This is the college church. Oh, good. It started to rain all day Wednesday. Started to snow all day Wednesday. And I was sort of hoping maybe the snow would be so bad, maybe they'd cancel church that night. Didn't work that way at all. In fact, when I got to the parking lot, it was jam full. There were cars everywhere. I was scared to death. But the Lord helped me through it. And He'll help you through it. Just something simple as leading a prayer meeting, making a restitution. Fear can paralyze you, and I could give a lot of illustrations there. Now, I'm coming to the heart of the message. I want to make a point here now. A proper fear can develop into a proper sense of authority. There's a connection between fear and authority. I want to illustrate this for you by taking you back to a an experiment in psychology that was done at Princeton University quite a few years ago. Most people who study a little psychology in college, probably in Psych 101, would probably find this laboratory experiment in their textbook. Let me tell you how it worked. Stanley Milgram was a professor of psychology at Princeton University, and he and his students were interested in this concept of perceived authority. He's trying to determine how could the people of Germany fall in behind an Adolf Hitler and allow the Nazis and the SS to convince them that the Jews were bad and that it was okay to round up Jews and ship them off to extermination camps. Seemingly otherwise good people, balanced mentally, nothing wrong with these people, but yet Germans by the thousands got involved in rounding up Jews and shipping them to their death. What was there about their leaders that convinced people to follow so blindly such terrible commands? Some of you have heard about the My incident that took place in Vermont, where Lieutenant Calley and his men would just gun down civilians, and his men would follow orders blindly. There was a lot of press about that a number of years ago. Then there's Jonesboro and some of these cult leaders. How do they get such a grip on people to where people will just follow them blindly? Jonesboro and what's the one, David Koresh and that group out in Texas. Some of these cult leaders, they get a sort of a mystical grip on people's mind, and people will follow them without asking questions. Well, Stanley Milgram and his students put together an interesting laboratory experiment, and follow me closely here. If you miss one line, you're going to miss the whole point when I get to the end. Here's what they decided to do. First of all, they got someone in the construction department to build them a sophisticated piece of equipment that looked like it was very intricate, but it was nothing more than a fake box with about 25 or 30 switches on the front and a little row of red lights above each switch. And they set this thing down at a desk out in a room. Then in another room that was separated with a picture window between them, they put a chair. And then above that window, they put a light bulb. That was a signal. Now what they were going to do is see how many people would be willing to sit down at that desk and push a button and administer a shock to somebody sitting in the other room. I'll explain to you how it works. They ran an ad in the paper. They agreed to pay people off the streets X amount of dollars if they would come in and participate in the university experiment. So here come these people walking in looking for a fast buck, and Dr. Milgram and his students explained to them, here's how it works. Now you sit down here at this generator. This is a shock generator, and as you push this first button, above it you see 15 volts, and above the next one is 30 volts, and the next one, and each one goes all the way up to 450 volts. And as you push this button, it'll send a shock through those wires to the person sitting in the chair in the other room. And we'll tell you how it works. Now, first of all, we'll take you in the other room, and you sit down in the chair, and we'll hook you up, and we'll give you a little shock. So they'd give them a 15-volt shock just to sort of tickle them a little bit, just enough to recognize the wires were hot. Now, they didn't realize that they were supposed to be the teachers, but actually they're the victims. So what would happen is Milgram would get his own students who knew what was going on to volunteer to sit in the chair in the room where they were going to get tortured. The guy off the street, he's given a list of questions to read. There's 2 columns. There's matched pairs, and it's not important how it works, but what happens was this. The student of Milgram is sitting in the room in the chair. This guy off the street reads the questions over the PA system to the guy in the other room. They've closed the door, and he's sitting in there now all wired up. And every time he gives an incorrect answer, he's supposed to zap him. So he reads the question. Pretty soon the guy makes a mistake, and he gives him 15 volts. Now when he does this, a 15-volt lights up in the other room where this guy at the desk can't see it. So Milgram's student, he jumps around a little bit like he's really been hurt. So they keep going, 30 volts, 40 volts, and as they move up higher voltage, these students are responding with more and more, what would you say? They're really getting zealous over there. After a while, they're jumping around. They get to the point where they're screaming and crying out in pain, begging for this to stop. Now here's Dr. Milgram standing there with his clipboard. He's just a little short guy. He's got on a white lab coat, and he's very official looking, and he says, no, the test has got to go on, keep going, keep going. And these people off the street, one after another, they're sitting down at this control panel, just zapping away people they don't even know for giving incorrect answers. Now, after they went through about 25 or 30 people, they stopped the experiment, and Milgram sat down with his students to analyze what was going on. And here's what they found out. First of all, it says think about it now, they're torturing a fellow human being that they don't even know. And 65% of all of these people off the streets were willing to go all the way up to 450 volts. 65% of them went that far. And the question, the point was made, the students first of all said, why, these shockers off the streets must have been sadists or bullies or weak-willed and couldn't think for themselves. But they wouldn't do it. Well, the fact of the matter is they would do it. And they arrived at this conclusion. With the lab instructor standing there with his soft, official-sounding voice and his white lab jacket, in this elegant laboratory in this big university, he is fully in charge, and he tells them it's okay, keep going. They're willing to follow orders and keep going, regardless of what they're doing to the guy in the other room. In other words, they saw Dr. Milgram as a perceived authority, and as long as he says it's okay to do it, they're willing to keep on doing it. Perceived authority. Now, such obedience to perceived authority is ingrained in all of us. You have that built into you. Let me show you what I mean. For example, let's say I took you into a restaurant tomorrow, and the lady comes and takes our order, and she serves us, and we eat our meal, and when it's all done, somebody comes out and says, now, if you'll just take your plates over there and wash them up and put them in the cabinet, you'll be free to leave then after you pay your bill. You look at him and say, what are you, crazy? We're here, we're paying for our meal. You got people to clear tables. That's not part of the deal. You would recognize they didn't have the authority to tell you that. But you know, if you're in Uncle Sam's army and he tells you to go in that mess hall and eat and do this, this, and this and get out of there in 5 minutes, you can't go fast enough. What's the difference? The difference is the guy in the restaurant has no perceived authority from you, but the sergeant's got all the authority, and you're smart enough to know the difference. Or let's suppose that you're driving down the highway. Maybe you've had it happen, where you look in the rearview mirror and it looks like a flashing Christmas tree light behind you. Have you ever had that happen to you? Well, you don't want to put up your hand. Some of you already did. You know what I'm talking about. Oh, you talk about fear as a motivator. Maybe later in the week I'll tell you what happened to me once or twice. And I'll tell you, I got out of that car to talk to the officer, and I was shaking like a leaf. You talk about adrenaline, I started to chatter. I couldn't even pronounce my words right. After he's writing my ticket, I said, you look like such a nice guy. And he says, well, I am a nice guy, and hands me the ticket. I'll tell you later how that worked out. It wasn't quite as bad as it sounds. Let me get a little bit more close here. Suppose you're walking through the park in the city, and somebody steps out from behind a tree and says, take off all your clothes. What are you, some pervert? You get your cell phone and dial 911 and start running? What's going on here? What do you mean, take off my clothes? But next Thursday morning, you'll go down to the doctor's office, and you'll sit down in the waiting room, and that little 4'9" nurse will come out and she'll do this to you. And just like a magnet, you'll just get right up out of your seat and follow her right down the hallway. And she'll point to that little closet where there's a pile of paper, mache, whatever that is, and she'll say, all of it. Who, me? You know how you act. And you'll do it. Why don't you pull out your cell phone and call 911 on her? Because she has perceived authority. She has a right to do what she's doing. In fact, you're paying her to do it. The guy in the park probably is a criminal, a pervert. He has no authority to tell you that. Are you getting my point here? Some people have authority to tell you certain things, and you recognize the difference. The problem with Pharaoh was he didn't know who God was. He didn't recognize that God had all authority over him. And the problem with our world tonight is it doesn't recognize that God's got all authority. No wonder we're seeing what we do in our world today. Milgram demonstrated that it's exceedingly difficult to defy a legitimate authority. By the way, let me just give you a little tidbit on the side. This is a little parentheses, all right? There was a little sequel to Milgram's experiment, and I have to share it with you because I think it's so good. Milgram found out that some of these people off the street would sit down at that control panel and they would start up there and they would look through the window and they would see and hear this person hollering in pain over there, and they would go to a certain point and, perceived authority or not, they said, I can't do this. I don't have anything against that guy out there. I can't be hurting him like that. And they would get up and leave the console and stop. And what they noticed was every time that would happen, 2 or 3 other people would get up and follow them out at the same time. One said, I'm not going to do it, and the other said, well, I'm not either. I thought that was interesting. Can you see a little spiritual application there, young people? If you'll stand up to the crowd and say, I'm not doing it, God alone knows what influence you might have. My uncle tells about a certain situation up in the city of Ottawa, Canada. There's a gun factory up there. I don't know if it's still there or not, but it was there, and I've heard him tell about it. You go into the lobby of this gun manufacturing facility, and they have set up an interesting display. It's an object lesson you'll never forget if you see it. There's a tall ceiling, perhaps as tall as the ceiling in this tabernacle tonight. And up in that ceiling, they have mounted 2 steel shafts. Hanging down from one shaft on a heavy steel cable is a bar of steel that weighs 8 tons. A piece of cylinder, hardened steel, hanging on a cable. And that cable at the other end is mounted to a shaft that's on a frictionless bearing. In other words, it can swing freely. Mounted on the other shaft with a little motor drive is a fine piece of wire coming down, and on the end of that wire is a piece of cork that weighs 1/4 of an ounce. And when the people are ready to watch the little display, someone flips a switch and starts the motor running, and up on that shaft where the piece of cork is hanging on the little fine wire, it begins to rotate back and forth. And down at the end of that wire, this 1/4 ounce piece of cork begins to come over and touch up against that 8-ton bar of steel and bounce away. And that little motor just keeps that piece of cork swinging. Now, an interesting thing happens. To the naked eye, you can't see anything happening as that cork bounces off of that 8-ton bar of steel. But after 5 minutes, sensitive instruments can measure a tremble. There's a slight vibration in that bar of steel. 10 minutes goes by, and if you watch it closely with the naked eye, you'll see that that bar of steel is actually beginning to move in response to that 1/4 ounce piece of cork. And in 30 minutes, the two are swinging in perfect harmony back and forth. That piece of cork just bouncing up against that 8-ton bar of steel. Young people, don't tell me you can't have any influence. It didn't take 8 tons to move the 8 tons. It just took a 1/4 of an ounce that stuck by the job and didn't give up. And in 30 minutes, it's swinging in perfect rhythm. You have an influence. Some people say, well, I'm not positioned high enough in society. My job's not that important enough in the church. Don't believe that. Something else about fear. The fear of the Lord produces confidence. In Proverbs 14:26, it says, in the fear of the Lord is strong confidence, and his children shall have a place of refuge. You learn to fear God, and as you serve him and love him, you'll find confidence in that relationship. A healthy fear of God will produce that. Edmund Burke, the great conservative politician in Parliament in England in the 19th century, had a famous quote. He said this: "Early and provident fear is the mother of safety." Early and provident fear is the mother of safety. Don't override the checks that are placed around you, young people. They're there for a reason. They're there to guard you. They're there to help you. Why build a hospital at the bottom of the hill when you can build a little fence at the top? And don't tear down the fence that's been there for so long until you know why it was put there to begin with. Early and provident fear is the mother of safety. I want to close this evening by telling you about a member of my own family. It's with a heavy heart I mention this fellow to you. Some of you saw me leave the platform, probably all of you saw me leave the platform this evening. I know my wife was scared, probably thought I was going over to the room to have a heart attack or something. Relax, dear, I went over to get a piece of paper I needed. I have his picture with me this evening. Here's the evidence. What I'm holding up to you is a photocopy of the Houghton College Annual for 1917. The year that America went to World War I, my great-uncle William Kaufman was graduating from Houghton College. He apparently was an honor student, and not only that, he was a spiritual student. He was preparing for the ministry. Let me read to you just a line or two from this. You can see the caliber of this fellow. This is my grandfather's brother. It says, "William Kaufman is worthy of high commendation for fixing upon a goal and making everything contribute to its attainment." Some member of the faculty must have written this. His home is at Massillon, Ohio, in the bounds of the Allegheny Conference. Now listen to this. There, under such pastoral interest and teaching as he received from the labors of Reverends W.H. and Clara T. Williams, he found salvation in 2 installments. Yes, they preached holiness, 2 works of grace. Did you catch the name of his pastor? We sang the song this evening, Brother Glick. Clara T. Williams wrote the song "Satisfied." All my life long I had panted. My great-uncle was saved under her ministry. Isn't that something? God called him to the ministry. He traveled from Ohio up to New York, went through, did a dual program. Says he came in the fall of 1912, and with 5 years of earnest application has completed the preparatory and theological courses and graduates this year with honor to the special pleasure of the faculty. Brother Kaufman's a hard worker, but possesses a hopeful and genial disposition and will prove an effectual servant in the harvest field for Christ. So was his departure from Houghton College. Here's where the story takes a bad turn, though. My Uncle Willie went to Kansas, and there he met a young lady who was the niece of the president of Miltonvale College. Ever hear of Miltonvale around here? Anybody ever hear of Miltonvale College in Kansas? Old Floyd Hester was the president that kept that college going through the Depression year. A bachelor who took a lot of his own money, would walk into town to buy the provisions to keep that college going in the 1920s and 30s. His niece was a preacher's daughter, a Wesleyan Methodist preacher's daughter up near Burrow, Kansas, and my Uncle Willie went out there and married Aunt Edna. They were brilliant. She had gone to Houghton as well. She was a German and French professor. She could teach both languages fluently on the college level. They got interested in what they called social activism. What really happened is my Uncle Willie went to Oberlin College. Yes, that old Oberlin where Charles Finney was professor of theology in 1935, and Asa Mahan and some of those great 19th century Holiness preachers were on the faculty at Oberlin. But Oberlin went liberal, and by the turn of the century it was infested with Darwinism and German higher criticism. And my great-uncle went there to get his master's degree. And what I was telling you about in the service this morning, he bought into the liberal line. He let go of his faith. He lost his fear of God and went off in a different direction. He went so far as by the late 1940s, he was actually operating a communist cell out of the basement of his home. He was a Stark County president of the Farm Bureau in Stark County, Ohio. My relatives at the reunion, they all hang their heads and say, yes, it's true, it's true. My brother joined the Army in 1960. They wanted to make him a military policeman. He almost didn't get through the FBI clearance because of the communist activities of some of my relatives. Now, I read you about Uncle Willie. He started off so well. Somewhere he took his eye off the ball. Somewhere he lost his fear of God. Some of you have heard my Uncle Delmer preach, Delmer Kaufman. He and I talk about Uncle Willie. I sat next to him about a month ago, and we were going through some of this again. I said, whatever happened to Uncle Willie? He said, we don't know. All we know is he went to a liberal college, lost his way. And he said the sad part of that story is, he said in 1955, my uncle had come down to my grandparents' home. They were retired, and he was moving them to Warren, Ohio, to live with him in the church parsonage of the Warren Church. And he said we had loaded everything up on my old 1954. He had an old trailer with spoke wheels on it. And he said we were just about ready to pull out late in the afternoon, early evening, and he said, Uncle Willie, he said, I hadn't seen him in years. He drove in. And he said, he looked at me and he said, Delmer, he said, I need to talk to you. I need to talk to you. My uncle, with tears running down his face, he said, oh, I'd do it different now if I could. But he said, I said, Uncle Willie, he said, we don't have any lights on the trailer. And he said, I've got about an hour and a half drive to get to Warren. He said, I got to get this load there before dark because I don't have lights on the trailer. He said, we'll talk some other time. And now my uncle is crying profusely, a general evangelist, preached in camp meetings all over the country. Said, I don't know how I missed it. He said, I think Uncle Willie was coming to me in old age, perhaps getting his last call from God. And he said, I failed him. He said, I never saw him again alive after that. My Uncle Willie died. He's buried outside Massillon, Ohio in the old Brookfield Cemetery. Now, I like to go to a cemetery. Now, I'm not weird. I just think it's a good place to go meditate once in a while. It's a good, quiet place. You can talk to the Lord. You can walk around and you can draw some inspiration just thinking about some of the old saints that are there. Many times when I'm driving from Salem, Ohio out to Ashland to teach an evening class, I'll tell my wife I'm leaving early. I want to go through Brookfield on the other side of Massillon. I want to stop and see my grandparents' grave. My dear grandparents, great-grandparents are in heaven. And I'm not ashamed to tell you, I'll stand there while the tears run down my face and I tell my grandma and grandpa I'm going to meet them in heaven. It's good to do that every once in a while. Just slow up a little bit and think about death. We don't like to contemplate it. But somehow I draw strength. I don't know, from Hebrews chapter 12, since we're compassed about by such great a cloud of saints, I'm not sure how much the saints on the other side can see, but every once in a while I get the idea that maybe my grandparents can see me down here running my race. I know they couldn't see the sin, because that wouldn't make heaven a pleasant place to be. But maybe somehow this great cloud of witnesses can see me, and I'll talk to my grandparents, and I promise them again I'm going to meet them in heaven. But the sad part is I'll walk down around the hill. It took me a while to find it. It's a large cemetery, probably a quarter of a mile down there where Uncle Willie and Aunt Edna's buried. And I'll stand and look at that big tombstone, but there's just a coldness in my heart, just an emptiness. And I just think, oh, Uncle Willie, what happened? What happened? Saved at the altar of Clara Tier Williams. Received salvation in 2 installments. That is, he was saved and sanctified. He was ready to go into the ministry. But somehow he lost that provident fear of God, and he missed it. I want our organist to come this evening. I know everybody's braced against Sunday night services and camp meeting. You think we're going to sing 50 verses here tonight? Well, we're not going to. She's going to come and play some music. We're going to stand together. I just want to say one other thing while she's coming and while you're standing. Revelation 21:8 tells us also that fear can keep us out of heaven. Do you know that? The scripture says, "But the fearful shall have their part in the lake of fire, which burneth with fire and brimstone, which is the second death." Probably more people are going to miss heaven over fear than anything. There's one kind of fear we need, the fear of God. But we got to get away from this fear of each other. I wouldn't be surprised there are some who would like to come and pray tonight, but you're just a little fearful. Maybe the wrong person might see you walk down this aisle, and you decide maybe you don't want to expose yourself that way. I'm telling you, I'm not going to put a lot of pressure on. I'm just going to wait and see if anybody might have a need this evening to come and do business with God. Our conference president, H.C. Van Warmer, said, "I don't give long altar calls." He says, when the fruit's ripe, it'll fall off the tree. If you've got to beg them and tease them to come, it probably won't accomplish anything. But it just might be in the quietude of the closing minutes of this service. I may have been talking to someone this evening who needs to develop a fear of God, or you're hung up because of fear of people. And early and provident fear is where there's safety. Are you safe this evening, my friend? We're not going to wait long. A couple have come, and we'll be gathering shortly.